You may write a composition as you like it, but your readers will respond as they like it. Orlando, one of the principal characters in the play As You Like It, is a young man desperately in love with Rosalind. At one point in the play, Orlando, in an effort to win Rosalind, begins posting original love poems to her on the trees in the forest of Arden, where Rosalind, recently banished from the royal court, is living. Orlando hopes to win Rosalind's attention, and he does. However, you might imagine what Rosalind thought when she read the poem, "If a heart do lack a hind, let him seek out Rosalind." Even if you know a hart is a male red deer and a hind is a female deer, the image of gentle romance may not be the only one conjured. What would Rosalind think when she read a bit further? "Sweetest nut hath sourest rind, such a nut is Rosalind." Rosalind is flattered by the fact someone would write her love poetry, but she wishes such love poetry as Orlando composes would be kept to himself, at least not posted all over the forest. Rather than moving Rosalind to desire him, Orlando's poetry makes him an object of curiosity. What sort of man would write such stuff? The effect of Orlando's love poetry illustrates the importance of the passions in writing, and also the importance of governing those passions with reason. No one doubts Orlando's passions, but the effect of his passionate poetry will likely not be what he intends. Every writer faces the same problem as Orlando. How does one successfully appeal to the emotions of the audience? Controlling the tone of your writing is one way to express your own emotions while appealing to those of your audience. In writing, your tone may be formal, informal, humorous, serious, angry, proud, assertive, sarcastic, or any of the attitudes which you may express in your actual speaking voice. The tone of an essay is the essay's implied attitude toward the subject and the audience. And just as people respond to the tone of a spoken word, readers respond to the tone of the written word. Controlling tone in writing can be difficult. You must consider the connotations of words and the possible implied meanings of every aspect of your writing, the details you select, the ideas you emphasize, the arguments you use to prove a point. Again, consider Orlando. His rhymes about Rosalind are logical, yet they clearly stir passions different than desired. Orlando could express his love using any metaphor he chooses. Hinds and the sourest rinds of nuts. Though the audience watching the comedy may smile at such love poetry, the connotations of the word hind are obviously not romantic for Rosalind. What young aristocratic lady likes to be compared to a female deer or to a nut? In the ears of Rosalind, the tone of Orlando's poetry creates the tone of a country rustic rather than the tone of a romantic courtier. If Orlando wants to win Rosalind's affections, he must consider the tone of his writing as well as his logic. In the unit on childhood, I introduced the writer's triangle as a guide to revision. I encouraged you to revise your essay considering the writer, the subject, the audience, and the text. You will use the same critique guide for this unit. However, recognizing the importance of stirring the desired response or passions in the audience, it is important to consider the essay's tone as you use each point of the triangle. As the writer, you still need to consider your purpose, how you present yourself, and how you establish your credibility. But these points shape the tone as well as the content of the essay. Sometimes your essay may express more than one tone, but if your tone changes often or is unclear, your essay will appear confusing. Just as it is difficult to judge someone whose behavior constantly changes, it is difficult to judge the purpose of an essay with an inconsistent tone. You need to make sure the tone of the essay, your feelings towards your subject, represents you in an appropriate light, whether the tone is appropriate to your purpose, and whether the tone suggests that you are credible. In the first unit, I ask you to evaluate the subject in terms of the thesis. the major points required to support the thesis, and the specific information needed to support each of the major points. It is also important to think of your treatment of the subject in terms of the essay's tone. Information in an essay automatically takes on some of the biases of the writer. The fact that you develop a particular thesis or that you include one detail instead of another suggests that you consider that thesis and that detail especially important to the point you wish to make. Orlando can illustrate his love with any object of his choosing. He could choose a rose, a summer's day, but Orlando chooses sour nuts. The thesis and its development does not stir feelings of love, even though that is the subject of the poem. You especially need to reflect on the tone of the essay from the point of view of the audience. As before, you should be able to describe the audience, how you wish the audience to respond, and how the composition will appeal to the audience. Note how politicians tailor their speeches for their audiences. Politicians discuss balancing the budget differently in an urban center than they do in a rural community. You should know what information in the essay is likely to provoke the audience's interest and passions. What might bore them? What will the audience learn? What fresh view will you offer? Focusing too much on the obvious is dull and calls into question your expertise. As you consider your audience, you should be able to determine which parts of the essay your audience will especially like or dislike. Finally, consider the text of the essay. Each point of the triangle merely offers a different vantage point of the essay. Thinking about the text should underscore the interrelatedness of each point of the writer's triangle. In the text of the essay, you are juggling the writer, the subject, the audience all at once. Dropping one item will affect the others. The essay's tone will be altered. Evaluating the text of the essay, you still need to make sure the whole composition is unified, that each section of the paper is clearly connected to the others. You still need to determine what information you want to receive the most emphasis. As in the previous unit, this will require that you study sentence patterns, figures of speech, and tropes, and other methods for creating emphasis, such as using plenty of detail and giving additional space to important ideas. And nearly always, you will need to revise the text according to the conventions of standard edited English. Careless use of the language suggests a rather lackadaisical tone, or worse, a tone of indifference. Using the points of the critique guide and giving special attention to matters of tone, I will comment briefly on the student's sample essay included in your course materials. The difficulties she encounters are typical of those most students are likely to face. First, I want you to consider the essay's development and tone as it supports the writer's purpose, her persona, and credibility. In the first draft, the writer's purpose and persona are not clearly established. This is most evident in the changing attitude she reveals about her hometown of Lawrence. Her initial description of home as death row and her fear that she was destined to die in Podunk Sticksville are the exaggerated convictions of adolescence. I believe her feelings are honestly remembered, yet experience generally modifies these sorts of convictions. Her essay's conclusion states, "I somehow ended up back in Lawrence. Obviously something happened. Her feelings about her hometown are no longer the same." In the conclusion to her first draft, she writes, "I had accomplished my goal and decided it was time to move on." However, needing to move on and returning to the place she described as death row is an obvious change in attitude that needs to be accounted for in the revision of the essay. I wonder why she didn't just move on to someplace else. The simple fact that a year passed doesn't fully explain the writer's change in attitude. The effects of her leaving home are not clear, and that lack of clarity obscures the writer's persona and purpose. The audience is left wondering what sort of purpose or what sort of person, I should say, the writer is, and what does she want the reader to learn from the essay. As the student studied her first draft, she decided she wanted to focus on the effects of the experience. She wanted to convince the reader she matured as a result of her efforts to escape her home. Adding new information and deleting unnecessary material, the student revised her essay and changed the development and tone to support this new purpose. As you study the revised essay in your course materials, note how the clear details and language of the revised essay establish her credibility and create the persona of a good-humored and honest observer willing to admit mistakes. In the final draft, the writer's tone is one of humor and maturity. Rather than complaining and criticizing and bragging about her escape, the student admits her parents knew her better than she knew herself. This admission not only prepares the reader for the conclusion of the essay, it also indicates that she has come to a mature realization of her own lack of knowledge. The humorous tone used to describe the questioning she endured just to sell jewelry at the Marine Corps Exchange is another detail that indicates her increasing maturity. Clearly, the student is learning that life is not always better somewhere else. The tone of the revised essay supports the student's purpose. After identifying the main idea or thesis, we need to evaluate the subject of the essay. Does the content of the essay, both in details and tone, support the thesis? The thesis of this student's essay is not clearly stated in the introduction, but that's okay. The thesis need not always be clearly stated at the end of the first paragraph. The thesis is suggested or implied, however. Since the student believes her hometown is a prison, and that her freedom to become who or what she wants can only be found elsewhere, we suspect that her escape is going to teach her something about herself. And of course it does, as we read in the concluding paragraph to the essay. The thesis to the essay is best stated in the conclusion. I ended up back in Kansas because I grew up. I learned that life has a purpose. Unfortunately, the essay does not fully explain what she learned about growing up. She doesn't say what the purpose of life became for her. Likewise, the details of her experience need to be explained in terms of the effect they had on her. What did her experiences teach her? Similarly, if she wished, she could discuss more clearly the causes of her departure. To merely say her hometown was dull does not fully justify her actions. Many high school students find their hometown dull, but not all of them move away. I would be interested to know how precisely, or to know more precisely, what could cause her to leave home at the age of 17. The point here is that the essay doesn't fully explain either the causes or the effects of her actions. And looking at the length of her draft, it seems the student will need to decide whether to develop more fully the causes or the effects. To do both will take too much space and require a much longer essay than has been assigned. Because she chose to return to Lawrence, a town first described as podunk, I would suggest she examine the effects of her experience more fully. Such a revision would result in significant changes in the content of the essay. Almost certainly, the description of the trip south needs to be deleted. Though the trip is interesting and clearly memorable, it does not relate to her decision to return to Lawrence. Revision often requires cutting material we may have enjoyed writing, material we may especially like. The student's revised essay makes extensive changes in the first draft and effectively turns the expressive narrative into an informative essay examining the effects of the student's escape from Lawrence. Next, the audience. You need to consider what your intended readers will be like and how you want your readers to react if you are to communicate effectively with them. Different audiences will feel quite differently about a 17-year-old girl's desire to leave home. Parents who are currently worried about their own teenagers are likely to read the essay differently from a young person who has just rented his or her first apartment. If the student were writing to a parent-teacher association, she would likely adopt a different tone from the one she would select to address a special classroom of her high school friends or high school dropouts. Reflecting on the audience should help the writer select information. For the essay to be meaningful, the information needs to be directed to the correct audience. The narrative quality of the draft assumes an audience that likes a good story about growing up, something most people do enjoy. However, the draft doesn't go much beyond this basic assumption, and it should give the specific demands of the assignment. It should meet those demands more fully. You should always check your writing against your assignment. For this assignment, you must focus on what a particular audience would want to know about the causes or the effects of the adolescent experience that you have selected for your essay. For example, the student's essay in this lesson might be of interest to teenagers contemplating leaving home. It might be of interest to parents wondering what to do about their teens' efforts to escape. The essay might be intended to encourage others who are now on their own, whatever their age, to think about what they have learned from their own experiences. Insofar as it comes to a significant conclusion without being preachy, the student's first draft would appeal to the young. By warning of hardships, it does not glamorize the experience, and to that extent, the essay might be appealing to parents. Of course, the typical academic audience is the course instructor and the classmates. The student writers are always wise to keep this audience in mind. In her revised essay, the student finally detects or directs the essay to her fellow students and to her instructor. Since the student's audience is likely to have either recently moved from home or is currently contemplating such a move, the student must offer specific details that will make her seem to be something of an expert on this issue. College students know that moving is more than packing boxes in the car. Perhaps the most important task in academic writing is to avoid the obvious and the superficial. In the revised essay, focusing on the difficulties of her experience, the student gains credibility. Likewise, her being able to smile at her experience makes her more sympathetic to young and old students and to the instructor. Young and old alike can smile at the student's enthusiasm for her minimum wage job. At $4.50 an hour, I was sure I would be out of town in no time. This reminds us of our first jobs and the wealth they seemed to promise us. It never took long to discover how minimum wage was very minimum. April's ex-boyfriend was stationed with the Marine Corps at Camp Lejeune, so we decided North Carolina was the place to be. I think only adolescence sees such hope in ex-boyfriends, but certainly adults will remember similar hopes. Illustrating both the humor and difficulty encountered in the experience with specific details and thoughtful insight, the student writer appeals to the feelings or the emotions of the intended audience, as well as to their natural interest in what can be learned from a fairly common experience. As I have noted, the text of the essay brings together the writer, the subject, and the audience. After examining the essay from each corner of the writer's triangle, you can often discover possible revisions by examining the text itself. Consider how the text of the essay is unified. I have already distinguished between expository and expressive writing and stated that the student's first draft needs to focus more clearly on the expository or the informative elements, the causes and the effects of her experience, instead of on the narrative qualities. The first draft of the student's essay does present an interesting narrative. She announces her goal immediately. She wants to escape her hometown, the boredom of Lawrence. She wants to find her freedom. But after describing her goal, the student wrote more than 2 pages on the experience of the move itself. She describes in detail the hotels she stayed in on her move. They were all the same: green carpet, green curtains, green towels. The description of her first days in Jacksonville, North Carolina, and of her 18th birthday hold our attention and gain her credibility as a storyteller. But suddenly we come to the conclusion. After a year of living in North Carolina, I somehow ended up back in Kansas. When I read the conclusion, I did not understand how the details of her experience had led to the return. What exactly did all those experiences of the move teach her? What were the specific effects of her actions? In the first draft, the narrative of her escape replaces the assigned purpose of the assignment, of the essay assignment itself. In place of the chronological sequence of information, emphasizing memorable details from the trip, the student needs to consider organizing the essay in such a way that it emphasizes causes or effects. Emphasis is another issue you should consider as you examine the whole text of the essay. The emphasis is a matter of word choice and sentence structure. Those are the things that are especially important in this regard. The specific points to consider are the needless repetition of words or phrases creating false emphasis and monotony, and the selection of specific or concrete nouns and clear action verbs which emphasize the agent or the subject of the verb and the action the verb describes. Since this unit is concerned with the emotional qualities of the essay, you need to add to these points the importance of emphasizing or choosing language that creates the desired tone. In writing, the emotional content or connotations of words should not be separated from their dictionary definitions or denotations. In the essay's first draft, phrases like death row and convicted murderer effectively set the tone for the student's essay. Interestingly, when describing what she learned, the student's word choice is not overly dramatic. She tends to state what she learned from the experience in fairly objective language. I met a lot of interesting people, she writes, and I ended up back in Kansas because I grew up. Such language may be acceptable because we often find life's lessons to be pretty mundane. The student does a good job in selecting words with the appropriate connotations in her revised essay. Emphasis is also created by giving appropriate space to important ideas. If we look at what receives the most space in the essay, we discover the lessons learned are given only a paragraph. Though they are placed in the important position of the conclusion, the place of greatest emphasis, they do not create a strong impression because that space is so short. The largest segment of the essay focuses on the actual escape from her hometown. Again, though this is interesting, it doesn't relate to the thesis, and by taking up so much space, it overshadows the real purpose of the essay. The development of paragraphs also suggests something about how well the writer has explored the main points of the essay. In revising her essay, our student author needs to give more space to the lessons learned. Doing so will provide those lessons more emphasis. She can also give more emphasis to the lessons learned from her experience by evaluating her phrasing of them. She may be able to use the rhetorical strategies mentioned in the unit on childhood, asyndeton or polysyndeton, or balanced sentences. Some examples of revised sentences using these figures of speech will be found in your course materials. Finally, considering the text, you need to consider the conventions of standard edited English. The final editing of a piece of writing may seem unexciting. Nonetheless, grammatical language can profoundly affect the reader's view and emotional response to your essay. One point of grammar may be reviewed here. That is the matter of colons. Colons can be effective introducing lists and introducing sentences added to clarity or to clarify and give special emphasis to a preceding sentence. You should, however, note this rule. A colon can come only at the end of a complete sentence. This sentence from the 5th paragraph of the revised essay offers an effective and correct use of the colon. The list that follows is punctuated with commas only. The student writes, "Now that my time there is over, I look back to what I gained from it. A host of new friends, some valuable work experience, I learned about repairing and making jewelry as well as selling it, first-hand experience of life on a Marine base, familiarity with a part of the country that was new to me." The conjunction "and" could have been placed between the items in the list, but by leaving the conjunction out, it seems the list could go on and on. This suggests the student may have learned even more than is mentioned. The final draft and the revised essay is in your course materials. You should compare the two drafts and note the substantial changes the student author makes. For most writers, revising essays is never quite as fun as the initial thoughts about the essay. Until one actually experiences some success, the invention or discovery of ideas always seems more exciting than the labor required to share them. But recall the poetry of Orlando from As You Like It at the beginning of this unit. Though thinking about love is often more exciting than the effort it actually takes to please another, love's purpose is ultimately to bring about the good of the beloved. Without his Rosalind, Orlando's poetry would serve little purpose. Writers must share a sort of love affair with their audiences. The passion that encourages a lover to speak lovingly is the sort of passion that will encourage a writer to write well. Both must see as their goal the good of the audience.